It's wonderful to be here. It still feels quite new to be doing face-to-face in-person events, so it always feels like a real privilege actually to be able to do that. So I'm just going to start with a rough overview about what this book is about and why I wrote it, before diving into sort of some of the main themes that I explore in the book. So let's just, there we go. So yes, first of all, the Vulnerable Humanitarian is based on doctoral research, which I conducted with the University of Sussex a few years ago now. My research was in Kenya. I went out and spent over a year there, interviewing national and international staff from a variety of different aid agencies. When I say aid agencies, I'm using a really, really broad description there because it did include the UN agencies, it included humanitarian organisations, it included development organisations and human rights organisations, because actually I think there are similarities when we're talking about burnout culture. I think there are similarities in all of those different sorts of contexts. But this book is also based on my own experience, and I have worked in different countries, different organisations, both international and local, over the years, and I have experienced my own burnout as well, a term which I do unpack in the book. But I certainly know what it means to go through the emotional upheavals of this kind of work, and also what it means to heal. And a lot of the book is really exploring what recovery and healing looks like, not just on the individual level in terms of what we can do for ourselves in terms of self-care, but also on the collective level with our colleagues, and also on the systemic level as well. So what does it mean for organisations to end burnout, or for managers to end burnout? So the book outlines some of the problems, but it also does suggest solutions, which are very much built on practice, my own practice, but also the practices of a lot of feminist organisations and other organisations and practitioners that are really looking at culture change and self and collective care in the sector. So yes, as I just touched upon then, a lot of the work I do is inspired by and built upon feminist, anti-racist and decolonial practice. And in short, what I'm really talking about there is looking at power dynamics, which is such a big factor in aid and development, and which I'm sure most of you understand that those difficulties. But what does it actually mean on the individual level, and how can we change ourselves in terms of how we conduct aid? And well-being and how we approach well-being is one factor of that. It's one factor looking at anti-racist practice, and also at how we shift power from organisations in the global north to organisations and people in the global south. And lastly, really tied into all that I've said already, a lot of what I discuss in my book around well-being is trying to argue that we have to see it through a diversity, equity and inclusion lens. I say that with hesitation because I feel that's a phrase that's also bandied about a lot at the moment. But we cannot look at well-being without understanding diversity and difference within the organisations that we work within, and the fact that lived experience matters and that lived experience varies. How someone is treated in the workplace is very dependent not only on perhaps their job status, but perhaps on other characteristics and attributes and lived experiences, and that is very important to look at when we discuss burnout. So, as you may have sort of realised, a lot of what I talk about is around culture change. It's not just around sort of what you can do for yourself in terms of ending burnout. So just to dive into sort of one of the main themes, one of the chapters in the book that I open with is the idea of the perfect humanitarian. And this is a sort of archetype that I created, built upon, I suppose, my own experience and who I am as a woman, yes, but also a white woman with quite a degree of privilege, and how in some ways that makes me the ideal candidate to become a humanitarian worker. But also looking at the other things that are expected of humanitarian workers when you enter into the sector, who the ideal humanitarian is. So I'm just going to go through some of those characteristics. So first of all, the perfect humanitarian often follows a particular career path. So I can relate that back to myself again. My background started in this sector. It started by going to Uganda initially for a few months. I ended up there for a few years. But I started off as a volunteer, and I sort of built my way up to a point where I managed to get a paid job in an international NGO. And then I started traveling to other countries as well, became a program officer for different country contexts, and also ran advocacy programs. And that in many ways is the typical career trajectory. And it's in terms of what university you might have been educated at, in terms of your mobility, your ability to cross borders with ease. These are factors that put you at an advantage, and is often where we see the career progression, particularly of people that have that privilege of having that kind of education and that kind of mobility as well. Also, the perfect humanitarian must be free of family responsibilities. So if we think about particularly emergency missions, emergency situations, what you often have are humanitarian workers that are there in an emergency situation, whether it's Ukraine or Haiti or South Sudan. They stay for perhaps a few months, perhaps a year, perhaps 2 years, and then often will go on to the next mission, the next humanitarian mission. And it was perhaps no surprise that as the years go by, and particularly as I got older, you see more and more that it's more men that are filling these roles, because you need to have that availability to be able to continuously travel. And what I found, particularly when I was doing my research in Kenya, when I was up in Kakuma refugee camp, is that a lot of the staff were men, and they might be married, and they might have children in another part of the country, and that was more possible for them than for women to be travelling in remote places, whether in their own country or elsewhere, if they've got children, because women so often are still seen as the main carer in the family. I'll come back to that in a little while. But the next point here is that the perfect humanitarian must remain tough and heroic. And this really is something that gets to this emotional heart of burnout and the struggles with all the different kind of emotional upheavals that we have with this work. Is that in many respects, we are expected to remain unflappable and able and competent, and that includes not showing too much vulnerability and not showing too many personal limitations or struggles. And really what I found through my own experience and through the research I've done is this in itself can lead to mental health problems and challenges for people, particularly if they don't feel able to speak up in their workplace about what they're going through, and instead have to kind of keep it all together in order to keep the work going. Because of course we are focusing on caring for others, and so caring for ourselves often gets lost along the way. So I can just talk again about my own experience here. This is a picture of me when I was working for Amnesty International a few years ago. We were documenting a forced eviction in one of the slums in Nairobi. And I just remember over that time interviewing people back to back whose lives have been devastated, who perhaps suffered abuse, and all sorts of horrific experiences, and often without the help that they need. And so often in this kind of work, we are faced with that and faced with the reality that there's very little that we can do, or we feel that we're having very little impact. And so this is the kind of reality I was seeing over and over again in the work that I was doing. I certainly remember it when I was working in Palestine as well, and all the difficulties that you're up against there and the hopelessness that you can feel that nothing's going to change. And indeed, that was really what prompted one period of burnout for me, this feeling, what difference can I make? So the psychological effects can be really acute, and very hard to recover from. That's my experience. But what's interesting about this is also the terms that we use to describe these experiences. So there I am using this term burnout, and that inspired me to write my PhD on this subject. But what I found when I did my research is that actually, particularly when I was in Kenya, this term wasn't necessarily recognised by everyone. I had lots of European and American aid workers coming up to me in Kenya saying, yeah, I'll talk about my burnout, and yeah, we're all burning out, I've got that experience. And then it was very interesting that those were the ones that wanted to tell their story, although sometimes in the end they didn't. And that was also an interesting factor of the research, as people do fear really to speak up about it. But I would talk to others within my research, such as other international aid workers who were from Africa or Kenyan aid workers, and the understanding was quite different. So just to give some examples here from my research, and it's in my book as well. So this was a quote from Julie, a Dutch aid worker that I spoke to. This is all anonymised, it's not their real names in case you're wondering. And she was referring to the fact that she had talked about her burnout with a Congolese colleague, and her Congolese colleague hadn't really understood what she was talking about. And this really highlighted to me of, okay, how interesting that we use these terms, and indeed perhaps the healing we seek is through a particular lens, a particular language that we use, even in terms of how we recover as well, and the sort of Western model of recovery. So what does it actually mean for others that perhaps do not have the same access to counselling services or healthcare services, or indeed cannot escape the situation they're in and go back to a safe country because they are there living it every single day? And in fact, this was something highlighted by another informant of mine called Kevin in tackling the refugee camp. And this what he said, it was echoed by other Kenyan aid workers I met, that when you are living in hardship, you are born into hardship and perhaps seen a lot of struggle. Perhaps you have experienced some of the very issues that your organisation is working on directly for yourself. What does that mean for how you talk about your stress? And in some ways, perhaps it seems indulgent, particularly to talk about work-based stress, when perhaps employment is really seen as something to cherish in a very impoverished setting. So I suppose what I'm trying to highlight here is not to say that some people do not experience burnout, but it's more about the terms we use, and really becoming aware of how those terms can get dominated perhaps by groups with more power, more voice, and what voices aren't we hearing and why. So that moves us on to the issue around psychological safety. So this term is really just about our ability to share ideas, share experiences in our work environment without fear of punishment, without fear of discrimination in some way. This is what we mean by psychological safety. And what I found in my research, and again, certainly in my own experience, is that people do fear speaking up about mental health. And they do fear that they'll be judged and they'll be seen as incompetent, unable to do their job. And indeed, there is evidence for that, for people being moved on or ostracized in some way because they have spoken up about their experiences. So here is one example from my research. So how this particular person I spoke to gave me the story of a colleague of theirs, a manager who had been moved on from their job. They were suffering clearly from a mental health issue, and rather than really addressing that, the person was moved on. Sort of, let's get that out of the way, because this image of the perfect humanitarian of being so strong and tough isn't to be tainted, and it's very hard to go beyond that, and for people to actually be real with each other. And likewise, someone else I spoke to, a Kenyan aid worker, who told me that, even though a counselling service often is available in organisations, people don't want to use it in case it gets reported back to the employer or to HR or whatever, and it's seen as a sort of black mark against their record, and that they might be seen as incompetent for the role that they're in. And just to go back as well to the sort of concept of the perfect humanitarian and what's expected to sort of really be given that status in a way. And one aspect of that is the career choices that we are able to make, and how perhaps these differ according to gender, but also other attributes as well. So just to go back to the realities I was talking about earlier of the fact that it's often men doing the humanitarian work in the very sort of remote areas. One woman told me how she was working in a refugee camp in Kenya and really had to leave her job in the end because she took her 2 children with her. She was from a village that was a day's journey away, and her husband wouldn't want to look after the children, and it was really up to her to do that. So she took her children with her. She was unable to cope with that in a refugee environment where she's supporting refugees and trying to look after her children. So these are some of the challenges that we see for women, and I would say particularly national staff in perhaps contexts where it's very hard to take your children with you somewhere and work in that sort of environment. And likewise, another Kenyan woman highlighted to me how, while she loved the job that she was doing, again working in tackling the refugee camp, she suspected men would judge her for being perhaps too confident, too outgoing, too ambitious, and therefore perhaps she would have to make different career choices in the long run. So all of this for me are factors in why there is struggle within the sector. Burnout is not just about the specifics of the job, such as the exposure to the suffering that we see and the pressures of trying to help others, but perhaps it's also to do with how the whole sector is set up and the structure of it and the sort of unspoken rules of it, and how that's likely to impact some people more than others. Another example of that is the differences between national and international staff. So we've heard a lot recently, if we've engaged in any of the discussions around the discrepancy between salaries between international and international staff. And that's one factor, but not the only one. It's also about the day-to-day treatment and what privileges you get if you are an international staff member and what you don't get if you're a national staff member. So I'm going to just give the example of John, who was a Kenyan man who worked for a UN agency up in Kafina. You can actually read from the book my account of this and my interview with him. So John had worked for the same UN agency in Kafina for over 10 years. When we met one morning, we sat outside the guest house I was staying in and where other aid workers lived. Under the shade of a thatched parasol, munching on pancakes, a weekly treat prepared by the kitchen staff, and with chickens squawking in the coop outside, he told us about some of the colleagues that came, some of the challenges that came with the status of national staff. He told me how a journey back to his wife and children in Kisumu in Western Kenya for his rest and recuperation, or R&R, involved a 1-hour chartered flight from Kakuma to Nairobi, followed by a 6-hour journey by road to Kisumu. And whilst flights to Nairobi for international staff were covered by his employers, John had to pay for his entire journey from Kakuma to Nairobi and onto his village out of his own pocket. To save money, he had on occasions travelled to Nairobi by road rather than air. But this brought its own risks due to ambushes by warring pastoralists in the Turkana and Pokot regions. John's status as national staff thus created many inconveniences, including the logistics of getting to his family home in Kakuma, a journey which would eat into his rest and recuperation, and was a logistical challenge that would unlikely be shared by his expatriate colleagues, whose journey out of Kakuma for R&R tended to end in Nairobi. So this is just a story just to highlight how the differences there are complex, and sometimes we don't pay attention to them. And I must say, doing this research really shone a light on things which I have lived over the years and been a bit blind to. So it was through talking to people like John that I realised the extra struggles, the extra work, the extra labour that goes into the jobs that national staff are doing, which perhaps I wasn't so aware of. So that's all the bad stuff and all the problems, but this book is not just about problems. I really wanted to look at what the potential is for change from within, and where does that start? So the second half of the book is very much about that. It's very much inspired by practitioners who are exploring change from an inner level, but also a systemic level, a personal level and a systemic level. So it's inspired by that, and again through my own reflections and what I've done for myself as well, in that sort of journey of not only recovery from burnout, but also what would actually mean when we talk about equity, for instance, in organisations, or we talk about feminist practice or anti-racist practice. So there is one chapter in the book that provides guideposts for assessing organisational culture. I'm going to kind of whiz through them now. Yeah, so I'm just going to whiz through them a little bit. But these really are guideposts for managers, certainly, but also I think they're relevant for a lot of staff as well, in terms of things that we might want to look at when we talk about culture change. So first of all, I write about levelling the playing field between how staff are recruited, trained and rewarded. So really touching upon what I just discussed there with John's story. Certainly more attention needs to be paid to salaries and compensation, and I think there is work happening there. There is actually an organisation based in the University of Edinburgh that's working on fair reward, and what does fair reward mean? What are the principles of fair reward, particularly within the development and humanitarian sector? But also just looking at how are people recruited and why are they recruited, and how we might pay more attention to things like a person's lived experience, as well as whether they've been educated at an elite university and whether they're able to cross borders and go to different countries. What about the actual experience of national staff, the expertise that they have, which are not always emphasised when we look at the sort of skills for the job. And likewise, how staff are protected, how they are supported and looked after, particularly when we look at security risks and how those differ according to who people are. So that if you have a security officer in an organisation, having an idea of the differences within the workforce and the different needs according to whether perhaps you're a man or a woman, but also perhaps sexual orientation as well. So really looking at those sorts of differences and how different people can be supported. Secondly, I talk about rethinking leadership and hierarchy, and this is just again around how we shift power from the global north to the global south, bearing in mind that a lot of the top leadership within the big international NGOs remains white men and also white women. So what can we be doing at the top level to change that so that it's giving people from marginalised groups more of an opportunity to lead, and again, particularly as they may well have lived experience relevant to the actual work that's being conducted. But even on a more sort of team level, how to really enable everyone to be leaders, because leadership is just as much about being able to speak up on social justice issues, being able to speak up on change within an organisation and feel heard, and feel that you can have influence, even if you're a junior staff member. So there's quite a lot of discussion in the book about what that looks like in terms of feedback mechanisms, communication, and how you can welcome in ideas from perhaps people that aren't from the dominant culture, and how that might be done. And thirdly, making wellbeing strategies inclusive. So this is really understanding that whilst there might be some staff care strategies in place in organisations, there's often a counselling service, for instance, just recognising that first of all, perhaps counselling isn't the answer for everyone. Indeed, a lot of cultures and traditions, in my experience in the countries I've worked in, find talking therapy is actually re-traumatizing. And so perhaps looking at those different cultures and traditions and what wellbeing practices are already there, are already existing in Uganda or Palestine or whatever country it is, and how we can actually emphasize that within the workforce, so it's answering to different people's needs. But I would also say it's related to other practices that we might use, thinking that they are appropriate, such as yoga or meditation. These might well be helpful for people and they become very popular. But when we focus on this, these are very individualistic methods for well-being that put the responsibility for getting better very much at the heart of the individual. And is that enough? So again, just remembering that collective responsibility, and also the responsibility of the employers in seeing what changes are necessary to make people more well and to make people feel accepted and safe and that they belong within an organisation. And so much of that is actually allowing those people themselves to come in and talk about well-being and talk about what that means for different people according to different cultures and traditions. And lastly, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but the next chapter in the book, the sort of final chapter, is around self and collective care practices. So this is really more around what you can do for your own self-care, but also collectively, how do we bring awareness to power dynamics? How do we bring awareness to white privilege or racism or sexism within the sector in a way that offers up change and connection and discussion? Because there can be a huge amount of separation and toxicity within these working cultures, which makes it very, very hard for people to speak up and to share. So that final chapter is really opening up the possibility of how we can do this in a different way, through the way that we communicate with each other and the way that we take care of each other. So I tend to avoid the term safe space, because safe space is a very subjective experience. I might feel safe, but someone else in the room might not. But how might we create safer spaces where we can actually bring awareness to power dynamics and have uncomfortable conversations about what needs to change and take responsibility as well. So that's really what the final chapter is about. And aligned with that is also how you take care of yourself in the process whilst you're having these sorts of discussions around culture change. And that's really where I'm going to wrap it up. But just to say, this is part of my work now. So I do support organisations and I do support individuals to really look at what self-care, collective care, and systemic change mean for them, and to support them in that process. So if you're interested in that, then do let me know. I also have sign-up sheets here if you're interested in hearing more from me through my newsletter. But I also run a book club as well, which should be starting again early next year if you want to join that, which is talking about my book with me there, facilitating discussions, and actually it's a community practice. We are putting things into practice and exploring what it means to have culture change in the work that we do. So I'm going to end there and take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gemma, for that, come over here, for drawing attention to something that is often very difficult to talk about in the aid sector. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Should I use the mic? Okay. Oh, for the question. Got it. Okay, so yeah. First question from, we need it for, so just let me then repeat the question.
Oh, okay. Microphone. There's a microphone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is whether the statement of the government concept of burnout obscures the political implications of work as labor. So why burnout any of the word exploitation? And my question is like when you use the feminist and the colonial and also like a framework, in my opinion that would bring out workers with collectively unionize to resist that kind of exploitation. And given to the traditions of the vision to the end of the presentation around hierarchy and managerial improvement or well-being, do you think that this obscures the exploitation of the work that is taking place in the field? And just to end with an example, during my working experience, where workers were implementing evictions as part of a UN strategy in Greece, I was coming out and I had discussions whether this is part of burnout culture, that they couldn't do it or not. And the discussions that we were opening up is a big kind of policy is per se anti-feminist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial, not anti-colonial. So I want to hear you a little bit more on why you use the concept of burnout and not a different perhaps like concept of perspective on it. Okay, thank you. I would say I use the term burnout because it is commonly understood in some respects. It's being used a lot, and I do unpack it and deconstruct it in the book. So I'm questioning the concepts, particularly in the fact that it's not used in every country, in every culture, in every community. So to really argue that let's not make it a white-dominated conversation about mental health. So in that sense, it ties in with a feminist anti-racist framework, but whilst I'm using a common term, I am saying we need to become aware of why we're using that term. So I suppose that was the reasoning behind it. But in terms of exploitation, well, that could open up a whole discussion about, is all work exploitation in a capitalist society? I mean, the way that organizations and workforces run in the world at the moment, we could argue that it's hugely exploitative, no matter where you are, no matter what organization you work for. I suppose what I'm trying to do within the book is say that, okay, there needs to be a dramatic change. And, my personal opinion is that the aid sector, or at least in its current form, will be redundant in a few years' time because of all the problems, because of its inequalities. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to start with the people that are in it already and changing hearts and minds. And that's really what the book is about, because we have been stuck in the same work patterns for decades within the sector since its inception. How do we at least get people thinking about how it could be different, and what does that look like? And it starts from within that structure, unfortunately, even if that structure has to eventually be dismantled.
So maybe, Aggie, do we have any online questions? Okay, so if we'll take one from online and then I'll come back to the room. Yeah.
And could you just repeat the question for my
Yeah.
So the first question from the online audience is, any advice for people just starting out in the sector, and how can we on how we can protect our well-being and how we
So the question is advice for those just starting out on how to protect well-being as they begin their career.
Sure. I would say having awareness is key. So I think starting out with an awareness of why you are doing the job that you're doing. What's motivating you? Because I think we can go into this work with a huge amount of idealism that maybe is a little bit misplaced, even if it's good intentions. And certainly, if you're coming from a background of privilege, as I did, I think that's often the thing, and we realise that we can't give the help that we perhaps thought we could, and there's a whole problem around our attitude around helping others anyway. So having that awareness, so what does that mean? It means engaging in practices and conversations that bring awareness to who you are and why you're doing the work. And that might be something that you have within your organisation. I think it's getting better with certain organisations providing that in terms of kind of affiliate groups or listening groups that allow space for people to explore these sorts of experiences, but also outside of that as well. And I think, there are quite a lot of conversations happening through different networks, through different groups, a lot of feminist groups particularly, that provide collective care practices for development workers, so that people can come together. So I think that's key. But seeing what sort of changes you can bring within your organisations in terms of opening up those conversations about mental health, I think that's really, really important. And finding your support group within that too. Who are the people that you feel you can turn to? Whether those are people within your organisation or outside. Whether it's finding a counsellor or a therapist or whatever it is, or maybe it's just within your own community, people that understand what you're going through and can listen and support you is really important.
So I think we have at least 2 questions. Are you okay with taking like 2 to 3?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
All right. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
So
Thank you for your presentation. As you were describing the perfect humanitarian, I was understanding it as a component of the systemic nature of the toxicity that occur in environments of humanitarian intervention. And so the question is, in addressing that systemic nature as a part of your culture, how do you begin to kind of find an inroad or find an entry into an organization or as a secretary? Well, you mentioned that part of your work is addressing these issues with an organization. So how responsive and how open have organizations been in beginning to address this environmental toxicity when the example of the perfect humanitarian necessarily in and of itself is not a negative characterization. And people in hierarchy may be using that as a way of explaining the expectations that they have on their workers. In that dynamic, how do you then begin to start the conversation and communication with organizations about, might want to start looking at things from a different perspective because it's not serving the sector as a whole?
Question number 2.
I think humanitarian work work with many different organizations, and I was able to share my observation with you and see it is from in your research. So, did you see that the nationality of the organization has really respect to which humanitarian and workers in Canada, and how those organizations are responding to that? So, I saw that this is between, for example, Scandinavian and humanitarian countries, American. So in Scandinavian countries, there's generally a lot of balance. So one of the things with Scandinavian organizations, another thing is even allow me to go past whereas when I was working with American engineers, I was just calling for managers to do something like that. So there was a lot of different expectations, and I was just wondering if this is one of the experience or if it's really different between the nationality or the culture of the organization.
And we'll try one more. See how that goes.
Thank you very much. I like the topic because I like the book. It's very amazing. So first observation I have, even to get a remark, the people from Africa area, when you mentioned that a particular way to do it. Yes, it was stressful. Did you understand that kind of information? But also, did you share this idea with the Nigerians that this is at the center? Are they willing to actually use local strategies as a way of dealing with stress from an African or local aid perspective?
Okay, thank you. A lot of rich and varied questions there, so thanks. I'll go in order that they came in. So so where to sort of begin with systems or culture change, and I suppose the question is, how ready are people as well to really dive into that? I do think it's difficult, and I think the reason it's difficult is that culture change takes time. Things have been this way for a long time. It's not going to change overnight, and unfortunately the sector loves to have quick fix solutions. Everything is done within a 1, 2, 3 year time frame, maybe 5 years if you're lucky. And even when it comes to staff wellbeing, culture change, the same, it applies in many ways. So I think that's been a problem. I think there's also been a problem with a lot of verbal commitments being made, so a lot of statements being made, particularly on the back of the Black Lives Matter protests and on the back of the Aid to movements and sexual misconduct. but to what extent have things actually changed day to day? And I think that unfortunately a lot of examples of very little changing, and the bullying of whistleblowers, there's certain people staying at the top and not leaving. Those are all the sort of very negative stories that we hear. And yet, I do believe that there are pockets, there are particular teams, there are particular departments within organisations, and indeed at the senior level, where people are really fully committed, but trying to get buy-in is hard, trying to get the buy-in of everyone, because everyone's at a different level of understanding of these issues, or different willingness to change. It doesn't mean they're not going to, but I think that is going to slow things down, because we're often talking about hundreds of people within one organisation, thousands even. And I would also say the influence of donors, unfortunately, is a massive problem, and the conditions set by donors on outputs and deliverables, and not sufficient commitment to these internal issues. It's something that really does need to be looked at more, I'd say. So moving on to the second question, yeah, really interesting actually. I'm really fascinated by what you say there about the differences between Scandinavian organisation or an American organisation. I'm not sure I have an answer to that actually. I'd love to explore that more. I suppose having worked either in not necessarily a British organisation, but an international organisation based in Britain, or for national NGOs, it's quite hard for me to say. I mean, you know, different contexts and different work focuses and different priorities, I think, all feed into it. But I think that it probably is different according to the work ethic of a culture. Having said that, I think, again, because we are very much dominated and led by the global north, particularly, I would say, Britain and the US within the sector, the work ethic sort of filters down into all those different contexts, even if you're talking about wildly different work environments. So I certainly saw that myself working for a British NGO in Uganda and Kenya, and it's right, got to be on time, and you know, if someone's 10 minutes late, then you know, getting really uppity and not having really an awareness of why someone might be late, and the kind of interferences in their own life and their family responsibilities and how they travel to work, if they can't travel in a 4x4 like I was able to. So I think that's the thing, that's the stuff that's really interesting, is the influence of the head office in sort of filtering down into the different field offices and what's expected. And thirdly, yes, that's a really important question as well, about the different ways of approaching stress and mental health. Absolutely, I talked quite a lot to Kenyans about that, and also the Somali aid workers I met who were working in really difficult conditions in Mogadishu. I would say that it's a big discussion, but one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the role of religious faith, and the fact that we tend to sort of sideline that within the sector, and even in this country too, or that's just something that people do. But actually, it is a whole world view, a way of understanding the world, a way of motivating, a way of decision making. If you have a particular religious faith, it's likely to impact on every choice that you make, and certainly as a coping mechanism around mental health. I don't think we should be sidelining it in the way that we have, but actually exploring how we bring that in to our work environments, along with other traditions as well. So that's just one example. But yeah, there are others in the book, and it's certainly something I push all the time. And I would say in the chapter on self and collective care, these are not my ideas that I'm pushing and saying, here along comes a white woman to tell you all how to look after your mental health. It is drawn from different contexts, different traditions, with the idea that it should be something that's accessible for everybody. So yeah, thank you.
So I think we have one last question over here, and then okay, great. So last question to you. Thanks.
I'm sorry if I just shoot down, having reading myself right now. It's a sensitive topic to me and to put myself together is a bit hard. And every time it comes to my mind, it's always how maybe we are looking around and once again, we are putting our burnout as the main thing. And for me, the humanitarian social development gap all over the world that creates a demand of working so hard that as I haven't just performed one humanitarian MSF for my whole life, but I work in Brazil as well with regular humanitarian, not humanitarian, but anyway, I still think that the gaps are the problem, the social determinants are the problem. And although you get all your personal ways to go through it, it's the demand of work is so big and the demand of the needs all around you is so big that it will change. And I understand when you have what you're saying the history of the Kenyan, and I see my colleagues that are as well for company that understand less the gap as I do from my company. And I understand the level of quality. And I keep asking them, good, is that good enough? Well, maybe what is good for you is not good for me. And you push myself to the quality of good that I think is a good enough. And maybe the quality of good that you got to know your whole life, it's not the same quality of good. So for me, it's the gap of the social development that maybe sometime my organization is not able to deal with. I need a wash, I need you, I need all of them together. I need more different organizations, not just medical organizations, to be around me and understand that the burnout of the people that are there is because the needs are so high that we need more people to go around and support and change and make a difference on the gaps around the world and society. And I do understand that we understand the terms and I think what you said was so very interesting to put the terms burnout and we need to stop saying that. We need to stop saying there is a problem in the world, let people going and try to change it. And if the humanitarian person is coming burnout, good, something is really bad, throw that out and go to answer for the problem in general, not only for the person who
Yeah, you raised some really important points, and thank you for sharing from the heart. Yeah, I think this is difficult because we go into this work because we care, and we care for others and we care for what's happening in the world, and we shouldn't forget that's what's motivating us. That's what's actually inspiring us, and that shouldn't be trashed. And I think unfortunately there is a mismatch between the motivation, the emotional investment and the compassion that we have, and then walking into a very professionalized, almost sterile environment where you're not allowed to actually communicate this, and you're not allowed to actually share the emotion behind what you're doing. And I think we're missing something there, because actually we are all human beings. Or how can we be a human being in the work environment that we're in? We might ask that question of any work environment, but particularly the humanitarian environment, because we are humanitarians. So how do we bring humanity into our workplace so that we can show up as our whole selves, so that we can share our vulnerabilities, so that the people that we're helping are not just the vulnerable people, but we are also, that's another important factor when we're looking at power dynamics, is that we tend to other the people that we are there to help as the victims and the survivors, but actually all human beings suffer. We've just gone through a pandemic, we're still going through it, and many are still suffering from it. What does that teach us about humanity? So there's so much to learn there about human suffering, and the fact that we all will feel it. And if we actually own up to that, how can we connect with our colleagues better? How can we connect with the communities that we're supporting better? And ultimately take care of ourselves better. So it's hard to answer your question in full, except to say I sympathise. And I think we need more people like you. We need more people having these sorts of conversations that get to the heart, where we can actually be more human with each other.
Very quick question, okay.
I think that's all. I think you mentioned quite a bit about the remedy to burnout when it happens. But always talk about health, which we are including mental health services. There's sort of like emotional interventions that are involved. And I was just wondering if you think that this is really negative side working in the humanitarian sector, or whether it can be sort of changed to prevent it happening in the first place, or do you think it's the nature of the work that aid workers will want to feel sort of stem from burnout or mental fatigue or emotional fatigue?
I mean, I suppose my argument in the book is that I'm sort of saying that no, in a way, that there shouldn't always be burnout, because a lot of the problems of burnout are to do not with the work itself, but to do with the employer or the sort of work practices and working culture. And if we can change that, then maybe there will be less burnout. But in some respects, I also agree that this is difficult work, and going back to this importance of self-awareness, there needs to be self-awareness. If you've got the idealism of wanting to go into the humanitarian sector, it's healthy to look at where does that idealism come from? You know, what are your motivations? What do you feel you can achieve? Because it's very hard to ever respond fully to all the demands and all the problems in the world. We probably never can do that. You know, there's a lot more that could be happening at government level. If the government was doing more and different governments were doing more, perhaps we wouldn't need to be doing this work in the first place. So, you know, there's a lot there around the difficulties that are unavoidable because of the nature of the world and the fact that there is a huge amount of suffering in the world. Not one person can end that suffering. So I think it's certainly a reflection on what boundaries we are able to put in place to remember what we can and can't achieve. There's a lot in my book about that and how you actually look at your own boundaries around the work you do, and how you recognise that this is going to be part of the work, the struggle, the emotional struggle and challenge, and how to look after that, not just for yourself, but for your colleagues as well.
Great, thanks, Gemma. Please join me in thanking her for